So we all have an ego. We can't avoid the ego. It's built into us. We have a way of processing it. Aristotle's right. We have reason. We have feelings. Kant is right. We have a commitment to ourselves, but our commitment to ourselves isn't the only commitment we can have. Can you appreciate your own ego and still take someone else's ego into account?
Absolutely.
Where two or more are gathered. We're trying to mold or meld our egos together in this class. That's one of the reasons I ask you so many questions and ask you to participate. I'm curious what's going on the inside. Okay? Ethical egoism, then, is how do we live in community with one another, given that we're all invested in ourselves? What's in it for me? What's in it for me does not have to be a negative. The difference between egoism, which is self-centered, and selfishness is what distinguishes ethical egoism from selfishness. Selfishness means my way or the highway. Doesn't matter what you think, my way or the highway. Whatever happens, it can only please me. It can only take care of my needs, my aspirations, my goals, my dreams, my hopes, whatever they are. Ethical egoism tries to accommodate everybody's ego. It at least sees other egos as relevant to the ethical framework in which we live. But it never negates your ego, because you can't. Your ego is an integral part of you. You can't get rid of it. You might be able to minimize your desires for the sake of somebody else. That's cooperation. Or something called altruism, where you put other people's needs before your own, but you still have needs. You're just putting someone else's needs before your own. So ethical egoism wants to examine how we live in community or in harmony with one another. It doesn't mean we all get in lockstep, we walk the same way, we talk the same way, we think the same way. It allows us self-expression, self-interest, but not to the exclusion of anybody else in the group, or we're not a part of a group. Does that make sense to everybody? Help me out, because you're going to see half your quiz is going to be on ethical egoism. Okay, so I want to play a video for you. Fella does a very nice presentation of this, about 5 minutes long. Now he's going to expand this a little bit. He's going to talk about teleological and deontological ethics. He's going to talk about normative theory, so we're just going to incorporate this.
Is a theory that is based on self-interest. That is, the pursuit of self-interest is considered ethically correct, since the theory assumes that everyone acts in their own self-interest. Before we look at ethical egoism in more detail, let's look at the entire concept map of all normative theories, so we know exactly where ethical egoism fits in. There are two broad categories of normative theories, namely teleological and deontological theories. Ethical egoism is a subset of teleological theory. So we know that ethical egoism is a normative theory, which means that it is a theory that focuses on how people should or ought to behave. We also know that it is a branch of teleological theory. This means that it focuses on the consequences and outcomes of a decision rather than on intention. As stated earlier, ethical egoism is a theory that is based on self-interest. That is, the pursuit of self-interest is considered ethically correct, since the theory assumes that everyone acts in their own self-interest. It is important to note that ethical egoism is still a normative theory and should not be confused with psychological egoism. Psychological egoism describes how people actually behave, whereas normative theories describes how people should behave. So according to ethical egoism, it is okay or acceptable to make a decision or choose an action that benefits oneself. For example, Sam has been saving for a beach holiday. Prior to Sam finalizing his travel plans, his uncle, a volunteer at Educate Our Children charity, informed him of the organization's desperate need for a volunteer to teach English and literacy to poverty-stricken children in Africa. The cost of flying out and finding accommodation in the remote town would cost just as much as his planned holiday. Further, he would have to use up all his accumulated annual leave. Sam is facing an ethical dilemma. If we were to use ethical egoism, what would Sam's decision be and why? In terms of ethical egoism, it would be acceptable to pursue one's self-interest. Thus, in terms of this theory, it would be ethically correct if Sam chose to go on the holiday instead of volunteering to teach the children in Africa. From our understanding of what ethical egoism is and its application to Sam's ethical dilemma, we know that self-interest is the foundation of this theory. However, it is important to not confuse self-interest with selfishness. The pursuit of self-interest is choosing an option that would result in a decision maker receiving the net benefits. Selfishness refers to the lack of concern for the values of others. It refers to someone who does not care about others and does not care about fairness. For example, John has a Lego set. His friend Paul does not own a Lego set. So, based on ethical egoism, what should John do when Paul comes over to play? If John was selfish, he would not share his Lego set with Paul at all. He would not care about Paul's feelings or value his friendship. He would also not care about the consequences of not sharing. If John is acting in self-interest, he will decide to share his Lego set. He does not miss out on playing, so this is not really going to hurt his self-interest, but Paul also gets to play. As a result, John is likely to receive other benefits as well. He will maintain friendship with Paul, and John knows that Paul owns a train set, so he knows that when he goes over to play at Paul's house, Paul will let him play with the trains. Therefore, we can see how the pursuit of self-interest is not the same as selfishness. Let's build on the foundation of self-interest and consider the concept of enlightened self-interest. Enlightened basically means being aware of and informed, or having an all-around insight. So if we add this to our current understanding of self-interest, it means that we are well aware of and informed about our actions and decisions that would result in present and future self-interest. Enlightened self-interest might be applicable in John's case, and he may decide to share without any prompting. However, if John is not old enough to understand and acts selfishly, then his parents will probably help guide his decisions about sharing, because they understand the problems linked to being selfish and the benefits attached to sharing. They are the ones who will demonstrate how enlightened self-interest works. To recap, ethical egoism is a teleological theory. In terms of this theory, the pursuit of self-interest is ethical, but this should not be confused with selfishness.
That's your word picture for egoism. Egoism is completely about self-interest. However, it's a teleological principle. Teleological principles focus on what? Consequences of your action. So, egoism always looks at consequences of decisions that are made for your own personal benefit. If it's just you involved, do whatever you want to do. If you happen to find yourself in a situation where there's more than one, ethical egoism permits you to decide just for yourself, as long as that egoism isn't based on selfishness. Because selfishness excludes what anybody else feels, regardless of what their feelings are. That makes you self-centered. That's not egoism according to the definition philosophically of ethical egoism. Okay? So, if we guard against selfishness, and we realize that this is a teleological experience, we have the choice of either deciding for ourselves, all things considered, I think I'm going to do what I want to do anyway, or, because there are consequences to every decision, it may be to my benefit to include you, and therefore to modify what I want to include some of the things that you want. Because down the road you might be willing to modify some of the things that you want to include me as well. It broadens my horizon. And anything that broadens my horizon gives me a larger scope of possibility. Yes?
So is there a point to be made that you can't use psychological egoism with ethical egoism? We have to realize ethical egoism is based off TLF. And, like, yes, that psychological egoism is there, but that's talking about the self-interest part of it.
No, it doesn't. That's a great question. Now, hang on a minute. The distinction is, ethical egoism is a theory. It tells us how we should behave. We should behave in such a way that would either include just our interest or at least expand it to the interest of other people involved in our decision. Because the consequences of expanding our egoism might prove to be a better benefit to us. Psychological ego, and that tells us how we ought to act. Okay, so when you're in the box and you're growing up and your folks say, don't you think it would be better if you shared your toys with so-and-so? They're trying to tell you how to act. That's a normative theory that's based on ethical egoism. Psychological egoism describes how you do act. Yeah, he's just a selfish SOB. And that then becomes an attachment, a value, based on what he does do rather than what he should do. So that's the distinction. It's a good question because you may see that on your quiz, the distinction between psychological and ethical egoism, even though they're both egoism. One is how people do act, one is how people should act. In the box, you're learning, this goes back to Aristotle, from the earliest stages of birth, you're learning how to build good habits. That's what ethical egoism is all about. And if the enlightenment portion of ethical egoism is used, someone will sit down and try and reason with you why it might be to your benefit to do this rather than to do that. Everybody follow that? So the enlightenment comes from outside to begin with to help you build good habits, but after a while that enlightenment should be owned by you, and you begin to moderate your behavior based on what you think is in your self-interest, realizing that other people are always involved. And how does that pertain then to your ego, to your needs, your desires, your wants? Everybody follow that? Okay. You raised, go ahead.
I was going to ask in regards to the gentleman that was speaking said being taught these habits that we learn from parents or mentors and such. What if we take that out of the equation entirely? Those habits aren't taught, or the individual themselves learns this on their own.
When you pop out of the oven, I would suggest to you that your ego is totally self-centered. What you want, what you need, whatever. It's just completely focused on you. How can it be anything else? So over a period of time, and that's why it's so important we studied Aristotle, you are habitualized into community. What's best for everybody involved. So when we come up with the rules, it's based on the best interest of everybody involved. No lying, stealing, cheating, raping, and robbing. Now, some people are self-centered and they go outside the rules. I don't want to follow those rules. Fine, don't follow those rules. Make up your own rules. Because no one lives in isolation. Okay? How do we come to the knowledge of these rules that reflect values of community? Through habitual training from the earliest days. And I would almost guarantee sharing is one of the first lessons you learn.